So everyone, welcome to our very first episode of our new real estate analysis show. I've been mentioning this on the podcast recently, the last few episodes, that we're going to do something a little bit different, a little bit special, and hopefully this is going to flow into a different type of podcast to help everyone bring a little bit more value. So for a lot of you that don't know, my business partner here is Brian Benikin. And
Hello there.
And we've decided to really showcase what we do on a day-to-day basis. And that's going to be the main center, the main focus of our podcast, where from a property manager perspective and a commercial broker perspective, we're going to essentially discuss current economic trends and how that affects the multifamily market, and also bring you basically some additional education on how to analyze real estate properties to determine if it's a good or bad investment, and what you need to do to improve the performance of the property from a management perspective. So it's going to be something very unique that personally I have not seen anywhere out there on the internet, on podcasts, YouTube. There's a lot of different programs that focus on very certain specific items, but nothing that we want to bring to you. So I think it's going to be very special.
Yeah, no, I think so. In fact, one of the things, as Marc brought out, that we want to be able to distinguish is the perspective of a property manager and the perspective of an investor. As Marc mentioned, my name is Brian. It's Brian Beniquid, for those who don't know. And just a little bit of background about me and the perspective that I want to bring to the table is I've been doing real estate for the last 28 years. I've started out in sales, and I've managed a real estate office. But throughout that, I've also been an investor in apartment buildings, office buildings, and retail. And I've segued into being a developer, building condominiums for sale. So I have to analyze things like absorption rate, and more recently, building apartments for rent. So the perspective that I'm going to be bringing to the table primarily is, how do I look at a property from an investor standpoint, and how do I create value? A big catchphrase that's thrown around a lot in the real estate investment world is value add. And what that's really looking at is where are different angles, whether it's the cap rate being low or the ROI that I can bring up, that I can exploit to create value or equity in the property, as well as what are my entry strategies and potential exit strategies, or how long do I hold a property for? And so a lot of this is what I do on a day-to-day basis with my clients, kind of helping build their portfolio, telling them when to buy, when to sell, how to defer those taxes. And part of the marriage, we'll call it, between Marc and I, between Beniquid Commercial Real Estate and BG Asset Management is that when I sit down with my clients to create an entry strategy to buy apartment buildings and then when to sell it, a lot of that gets lost in translation. So whenever we do that now as a team effort, Marc and I will sit down so we can both understand what the client's needs are. Because when you're going in to buy a property, you have certain ideas in mind. I'm going to be raising the rents. I'm going to be improving certain parts of the property or doing capital improvements. And I'm going to do this with the mindset of creating value, creating additional income, while simultaneously being able to shelter it with the inherent tax benefits. But then when an individual starts out owning and managing their property on their own, a lot of that gets lost. So being that both Marc and I are real estate brokers and in the profession, it's a nice blend to be able to have somebody implement it, and then Marc, who's able to kind of carry it out. So we'll be able to look at both angles: real estate investor, property manager, running the property from a day-to-day basis, at the same time always being able to look in and know when to sell, when to hold, and how and what to do depending on the type of market that we're in, which is one of the things we're going to touch on as well.
So we're going to jump right into the very first segment. So these upcoming shows are going to be broken down into two segments. Segment number one will essentially, we're going to break down for you what's happened in the last week with the current economy and how that affects real estate markets. So this is going to be a weekly show that we haven't decided what day it'll air every single week. We're thinking around Friday, but we'll keep you posted on that. The second segment will go into analyzing an actual building. So this is a building that we've analyzed from for a client or the client's thinking about selling or the client's thinking about purchasing the property. So we're going to analyze an actual building and give you our opinion as to what kind of return and if this is a good investment or bad investment and what the building will take in order to improve the performance. So we're going to jump right into it. A lot of people right now and a lot of economists are talking about a 2020 recession coming up. It was just announced today on January, today's the 23rd, right? January 23rd, that we're now in what they call a late cycle. So many cycles, you have the early cycle, mid cycle, late cycle, followed by a recession. Once a recession is over, you go back into an early cycle. Many people are already saying that we are now in a late cycle based on many economic indicators. So with a recession looming in 2020, Brian, I want to get your opinion on this. How would this affect the single-family home market?
Well, generally speaking, the single-family home market, depending on different cities that you're going to be in, the further they are away from, again, we're in California, so our big epicenter is San Francisco, meaning that's the primary center point where the properties are the most expensive. And then it begins to kind of go out in a centrifugal or circular manner from there, like to places like Oakland or Berkeley. So the further away you get from that, the more you're going to experience that recessionary downturn where the prices are going to drop anywhere from 5 to 10%. You're going to get less and less offers, or you might get multiple offers, but they're not going to be at your asking price. And what you're going to be seeing, in fact, this is what we see as realtors now, is properties stay on the market a lot longer. You'll see properties 67, 90 days on the market, price reduction. In fact, nowadays it's so fast that emails will come out saying price reduced $10,000, and it will usually come in succession because it's become very, very scientific in the way that this kind of trend goes with realtors.
And there's one big indicator.
Yeah.
In Texas, new developments, they're dropping prices by 150,000. You can buy new homes in Texas for 150,000. So for some areas to be doing 150,000 price reductions, I think that's another indicator.
In fact, the really strange thing about this particular recessionary period that we're about to enter, which I totally would concur with, that we're heading in that direction, we're in that late cycle, is that this is one of the first times, and you've heard other economists say this, where the job market and the real estate market have kind of disconnected themselves. Because the job market is still relatively strong, where you're not having a huge amount of layoffs, especially in the tech fields and other types of fields here in California. In fact, we're still having different tradespeople being imported from different states into our state, and they're being paid double or triple. But this is one of those times where buyers are just simply not offering above the asking price. They're waiting a little bit longer. I think a lot of it is that they're waiting to see what happens. You see a lot of rumblings in the stock market. You have a lot of rumblings in government. In fact, we're currently in a government shutdown. And also, just from my perspective, real estate goes in these various cycles. It's not seasonal. So it has nothing to do with the fact that it's winter or summer being the best time to buy. Especially with California, from my perspective and what I've experienced for the last 28 years is that it's very cyclical. When I started back in 1991, we were just coming out of a big major recession because of the major layoffs in the defense industry. The Cold War ended. A lot of people who were employed by Lockheed or Boeing got laid off. And so those guys eventually got repositioned within 5 to 7 years later into the other tech jobs that we see now. And so, of course, by 96, 97, we started to see a big recovery. In fact, as an agent, I personally experienced this where all of a sudden multiple offers were coming back. People were offering above the asking price. And we experienced a huge upturn between 1998. We had a small little blip in 2000 because of the dot-com bust. And I think that's about where we're heading. And then we started running really strong again from 2001 to like 2007. And then we hit a big major recession with the mortgage meltdown, which lasted about 4 years until about 2012. So now why I gave you that little brief history is that usually what you'll see is real estate go in these cycles of 5 years, 6 years, or 7 years. So if you count down from 2012, 2013, when the market began to recover and different types of mortgages or lending restrictions became better and people could buy again without having to have super perfect credit and huge down payments, the market started to go back up between 2013 to present. And so we're in that 6-year to 7-year cycle. And for whatever reason, the economy could be going really, really strong. The market will begin to slow down within those periods of time. So usually, right about what I always look forward to is when you're seeing a strong market defined as multiple offers on single family residences for 6 to 7 years. Then right about that time, start looking out for things to slow down, and it could be major job layoffs, it could be war, it could be something else. In this case, it's something else. We don't really know until we've actually figured out why people are just slowing down. But as many economists have mentioned, 2000, they expect the economy to slow down a bit. I don't think it's going to be a 5-year or 4-year downturn where we're going to just be doom and gloom, which is what many people experienced in 2008, 2012. But I think it's going to be one of those corrections in the market where you'll, again, exactly what we're experiencing. Properties, mainly single-family residences, sitting on the market longer, people taking price cuts, the absorption rate on purchases or new developments going down. So you'll see developers pull back or drop their prices. And again, that's also going to be governed by the interest rate. If the government keeps the interest rates relatively low, then you'll see that the absorption rate will continue. People will buy. And keep in mind, too, that a lot of today's buyers are really spoiled by the interest rates that they experience. So now when they see the interest rates go from like 4.9 to 5.1 or 5.2, they think the sky is falling. Many forget that back in 1991, 2000, interest rates were 9.5%, and we were happy and just ecstatic when they dropped to 7.5%. And this was one of the times when the market just began to run.
My first mortgage was 6%.
Exactly.
I was happy.
Oh, mine was like 9.85, and I was happy, right? So again, a lot of this is perspective, and the big thing that you got to distinguish is the single-family home market from the rental market. So when you're an investor and people aren't buying houses, they're generally going to have a place to live unless they want to be homeless, and so rents tend to stabilize. You'll, especially in areas where there's already a lot of demand for rent, then a lot of times the rents will begin to climb just because of the simple supply and demand rule.
Yeah, and the reason why I really wanted to bring up the single-family market and how a potential recession could affect the single-family market is because many first-time investors end up buying single-family homes as their first investment property. It's kind of like the beginner's level of investment property, and many people think to get into that investment market, you have to buy a single family home. The one problem that we see is that with different cycles, the values can fluctuate greatly. I mean, look at what happened with the last financial crash in 2008 and how we saw some values. There were some values in Richmond, California that I saw drop 85 to 90%.
Yes.
Now, that's on the extreme side. We're not going to experience another downturn like that coming up. But you do see a lot of factors that play into the single-family housing market. So transitioning into multifamily, it becomes a lot more stable, right?
Yes, absolutely. And just to kind of segue off of what Marc was saying is that generally speaking, when people think of real estate investment, their whole perception is I'm going to buy a house, a single unit, and rent it out. And from the beginning, I always tell my clients, do not buy a house for renting it out. In fact, I train my agents to look for single-family homeowners, non-owner-occupied single-family homeowners, that specifically investors that may own 5, 6, 7, 8, or more single-family residences that they rent out. The reason I'll do that many times is because most individuals, when they start looking to invest and they start buying houses, they do so irrespective of a cap rate. In fact, they don't even understand what a cap rate or a capitalization rate means in relation to what a good investment would be defined as. So long story short, when you buy a house, the amount of income that you're going to be generating when you're looking at it from a cap rate perspective is going to be somewhere within the 1.5 to 2.5% cap rate, which is really, really low. Look at it from the perspective of taking your money, whether it's in a retirement account or a savings account, and the type of interest or income that it generates sitting in the bank. Now, we know that's probably less than 1% sitting in the bank. If it's in the stock market or mutual fund, it could be anywhere from 2.5 to as much as 4.5, and that's considered a good investment. When you're buying real estate and you're looking at it from a cap rate perspective, you want to be able to start your investment at a 5 cap to a 5.5 cap. If you're coming in and buying a building at a 5% cap rate to 5.5% cap rate, and you can predict just through the regular rental increases that you'll be able to annually raise your cap rate or your return on your investment from, say, a 5 to a 6, then the year after that to a 7, and then the year after that to an 8, then generally speaking, you're going to be in a good position or in a good investment. And just for those who don't know what cap rate would be, is investors will generally take a look at a property. They'll take into consideration the income that it generates. For underwriting purposes, they'll deduct a vacancy factor, utilities or expenses, repair reserves, meaning how much on the average am I going to spend fixing things that my tenants break, property management, and then a capital improvement reserve. So how much money should I be saving aside monthly, annually, in anticipation of those big ticket items? And then I'll take into consideration my new property taxes and my new insurance bill on that property, as well as maybe little things like certain cities will require a business license or certain fees that will be paid to the rent control board. So when you take into consideration all of these expenses and a vacancy factor, you're going to get what's called a net operating income, or NOI. Well, that NOI is what's left over, but before you pay a principal and interest or a debt service payment.
Now, before we go any further, the one thing I do want to mention to people is that, and this is something that's very unique that we do, is that when you're looking at purchasing a multifamily building, get a property manager's perspective on what needs to be done in order to reach those goals. One of the biggest mistakes is that people will, especially if they know how to do the analysis, they'll do the analysis and they'll calculate certain set fees. And typically it comes from an underwriting background. When you're underwriting the property and you have certain fees. I mean, what's $300 per unit per year is typically the average, right?
Yes.
For capital improvements. The problem with that is, depending on the property, you might require a bit more in capital improvements. It depends on the property you're buying and the current condition. So it's really important to then get a separate perspective to look at the building, look at your numbers, and then tell you, hey, this might be a little too low, or you're going to be okay with these set figures.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, just kind of going off of what Marc was mentioning, during the purchase, the buying period, you're going to have your due diligence period within your contract where you're doing your inspections and things of that nature. So if you have a background in underwriting, right, then you should be able to use that as a benchmark for what you expect. And if it's more than what you were expecting, is there a way that you can circumvent or correct it and still increase the value and create a cash flow? Now, going back to all that and just kind of cutting to the chase very simply, when you're looking at a single family residence for rent, most of the time, in fact, 99% of the time, when you run that type of an underwriting analysis, it's going to have a very low cap rate. And then later, as the rents begin to climb, your cap rate might begin to go up, but then so does your value. So if you, like many times I'll encounter an individual who maybe bought a single family residence during the recessionary period. And at the time they bought it, and based on what those rents were, they maybe started out at a 3% cap rate. But now, 10 years later, now they're at a 9% cap rate, but that property is worth several $100,000 more. So now when you look at it from today's perspective and what its value is, then really it's like having money sitting in the bank giving you a 2 or 3% return, again, because the property had gone up so substantially. And then you're leaving on the table a big reason why people buy real estate, which is depreciation. Because of the fact that now the property is generating, a decent return, maybe an 8% return based on its cash flow, it still won't have the inherent tax shelter that goes along with real estate because they bought it very low. So most of the time, again, I can go talking on and on about why it's not a good idea to buy a house for the purpose of rental. And if you should have a relatively short exit strategy, meaning I'm going to buy it, I'm going to rent it out for a while, and I'm going to ride the appreciation, and then I'm going to sell them and then exchange them into better performing assets, especially because of the economies of scale. If you've got 4 units or 8 units versus 1, everything will run more efficiently. Things will be a little bit less expensive because you'll just simply have more units to carry the load, which will in turn give you a better profit and a better return. And when you compare them side by side, there's just no comparison.
Yeah, one of the issues I see in managing a lot of single family homes is when the tenant vacates. Now there's no income coming in, and many owners then start to panic a little bit because now they're paying the mortgage. Now they're paying all the expenses on this property with no income coming in. Whereas if you have a fourplex, one tenant leaves, you have three other income sources that are going to be basically covering all the expenses.
Yeah, in fact, just kind of going off of what you mentioned there, this is also a big reason why banks who finance single family rentals or non-owner occupied, they will usually have a limit that they will impose as part of their underwriting guideline. Meaning, if you're an individual and you own 10 single family residences, certain lenders will only limit the amount of loans for non-owner occupied dwellings to 4 loans, some as high as 8 loans, some as high as 15 loans. But there's usually a limit. And the main reason they do that is based on what Marc mentioned is that when you take into consideration you have 1 unit and a tenant vacates, generally that individual, especially if they're managing it themselves, they're not going to be able to jump on it right away. So they might take a month to get the property fixed up, and then they get it on the market for rent, and then they entertain renters for 3 to 4 weeks. And the next thing you know, by the time they've got a new tenant in there, 3 months have gone by. Well, that 3 months superimposed over a 12-month period is 25%. So whereas when you buy a multi-unit dwelling, an underwriter will look at that multi-unit dwelling as like a 4-plex or a 5-plex, and they'll use a 5% vacancy factor. When you're buying single-family residences, lenders will normally use 25% vacancy, just because they will always take into consideration that most single-family rentals are going to be owned by someone who's not going to be as seasoned. And then at the same time, whenever a vacancy occurs, they're not going to have the effective rent that they're actually going to be used is really only going to be 75% of what they're expecting. This is why when you run the numbers on a house, many times the owner of that property will be slightly negative or have a small positive of $100 a month or $50 a month after paying all expenses and then paying that mortgage. So something breaks, all of a sudden you're coming out of pocket, and that property doesn't really give you cash flow. It might give you a loss that you could write against your gainful income, but you can do the same thing with multi-units while still simultaneously enjoying that cash flow, but being able to shelter it by the depreciation that it puts off.
So this brings us to the question of the day. If you own multiple single-family homes, should you consider selling these homes and exchanging them into one or multiple multifamily buildings?
Well, my general answer to that is usually yes. But before I, will just make that blanket statement of yes, you should do that, I always like to run an analysis on them. And again, what we'll do as part of that analysis, and this is something that we typically do with any one of our clients, is we'll look at what they purchased it for to establish what their original cost basis was, take into consideration what they're actually getting in rent, and then apply all of the given underwriting underwriting guidelines or expenses that you would normally do. Some of the ones I just mentioned. We'll also take into consideration its current present value. And then if they could take that same equity, could they have a better return or a better cap rate if they took that equity and 1031 exchanged it into a multiple unit dwelling, right? So, in fact, this is something that I'll train my agents to do on a standard basis: is locate non-owner occupied dwellings under one owner name that have multiple properties, because most of the time, when you run that analysis, they will find that they have a very low return on their investment, but they're sitting on a lot of equity that could be better used in better performing assets. I mean, case in point, one of my clients, older lady, I won't mention her age, but she had 15 single family residences. and they were mostly all paid off. So, she'd collect all of these rents, and there was herself. There wasn't that economies of scale. Whenever things broke down, she'd have to run and take care of it, or find somebody to do so, because there wasn't really a professional manager handling these things. So we ran the analysis on her investments, which is what she was using as her retirement. And we found that it was better to sell them and exchange them into better performing assets. So long story short, we took 8 of those houses and from the equity, because they had gone up substantially and they were free and clear, and we rolled her into a 90-unit building, an 85-unit building, a medical center, an 18-unit building, 2 8-plexes, and a 5-plex. Now, long story short, her cash flow went up substantially. The depreciation wipes off the taxable income on the majority of that cash flow, including the principal reduction, and it'll do so for the next several years, defined as up to 27 years. So she could enjoy that cash flow, and she could afford professional management. And when we underwrote every one of these buildings, we didn't try to make them look pretty and go, look, what happens if we're 100%, or underwrite it with the least amount of expenses possible. And in fact, we beat the properties up from an underwriting perspective, taking into consideration everything that might go wrong as much as we possibly could. And again, we can't predict the future, and things will break down in these buildings. But if you prepare for them and you know that what to expect, and you have a professional staff on hand that can address them as they come up, then as an owner, it becomes like a business for you. And as opposed to you being the one running around sweeping the properties, these things are going to be properly maintained, and you then, of course, can enjoy a better quality of life. So again, this is what we do all the time whenever it comes to analyzing individuals' portfolios, whether they own 3 single-family residents or smaller dwellings like duplexes, to as many as 15 or 20 single-family dwellings. What we've always done here at my firm for the last 21 years is look at those various value adds that multiple units bring to the table. And when I say value add, there's different ways to look at that. Just by simply going through the regular rental increases that you would do annually, say on your 4-plex or your 8-plex or your 50-unit or 100-unit building, you're increasing your net operating income. And that net operating income, what that means for you as a property owner is that your 5% cap rate that you may have started out with is now a 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or a 10. But provided that the market, meaning the individual investors who are out there buying property, are still buying at a 5 or a 6 cap, you have in turn created a substantial equity. Meaning your property, if you bought it for $1 million, might now be worth $3 million. So you've increased your equity by $2 million, and you find that you're in an option where, hey, would it be a good idea for me to now sell my 10-plex and create it into a 20-plex, right? And irrespective if the market is bad or not, you're in a position to decide, well, if the market is bad, and let me define what market is bad means for apartment dwellings. If the apartment market is good, most people are purchasing property at a 5% cap rate or 5% return. The reason they do that is because they perceive that the market risk in real estate is relatively low, and they can afford to buy property at a lower return, knowing that these regular rental increases that they or their property manager will impose over the next several years, and we're talking anywhere from 5% to as much as 10%, nothing drastic like 30% rental increases, that they can predict that their net operating income grows and their equity will also grow. However, let's suppose that the market in apartments is perceived to be bad. And so now investors will want to buy apartments at a higher return, meaning that instead of buying at a 5.5 cap, or a 5 cap, I need to buy at a 5.5 cap or even a 6 cap. So that property owner's apartment, if the market will bear a 6% return, the equity will drop a little bit. So instead of having gone up in value, $2 million, now it's maybe only $1.5 million greater than what they bought it for. So that puts them in a position where, do I decide to just keep the building? Because my cash flow doesn't go down because the market goes down. I can't raise my rents as much as I normally would, but my cash flow that I've enjoyed by raising the rents for the last 3 years or 4 years will remain the same. I may not get as much capital gain if I sell it at this time. But if I do decide to sell it at this time, I might make less, but I'll also be able to buy at a higher starting return. So maybe, for example, many investors now are buying at 4.9 or 5% returns or 5.5% returns, knowing they can get to a 6 or 7 within several years. But if they sell during a downturn market, that is if they elect to, because most apartment building owners are never in a position where they have to sell the building unless they've just really, really managed it poorly. Then they might not make as much, but if they do, they'll be able to buy something at relatively a higher starting return, and then ride that market again in an upward trend as they slowly go through their regular functions of running the building.
Okay, so this is a perfect time to segue into our second section or second part of the podcast, where we're going to break down an actual real world example for you, and we're going to do an analysis and basically management perspective on this building. So we have a building on 22nd Street in San Pablo. We will be providing some screenshots of what we're talking about on the video version. So if you're on audio, I would recommend at some point maybe watch the video format so you can see some of the charts and photos that we're going to be sharing. It'll probably make it a little bit easier for you. So we have a property on 22nd Street in San Pablo that a client purchased about it's a year ago now that he bought the building. And so let's jump right into it. This is a 3-unit building. Each unit is 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and there are 3 carports, 1 belonging to each unit. There's a small little backyard. It's on a corner lot property. And Brian, take it away.
Sure. So for example, we're going to start with a smaller building, just to kind of put things in perspective, and so not to scare away people who might be looking into buying apartment units.
Eventually, one day, we're going to analyze an 80-unit building on this show.
Yeah, no,
and that'll be a lot of fun to
absolutely.
do.
In fact, a big part of what you'll be able to see on the show is how do I take my single-family residences or my triplex or my fourplex and eventually end up with an 80-unit building or a 100-unit building or an office building. Again, these aren't things that are theoretical. These are things that I normally do. I've done for myself, and I've done for many of my clients for the last 21 years in the business. And I've been in the business for 28 years total. So a lot of this I could do in my sleep. But let's look at this property here. It's a triplex. Now, at the time my client bought this property, he bought it for $700,000. The market was very strong, and so investors were buying typically at a 4.9% return or cap rate, or a 5% return or cap rate, right? Meaning if they look at it from the perspective of buying a building all cash, subtracting all expenses, that net operating income left over would be the equivalent of at least a 5% return. Now, when he bought the building, the rents were roughly $4,450. So they were a little bit below market. And one of the things that we looked at is, well, if we take it into consideration, we look at the income, we subtract a vacancy factor, we apply the utilities that are actual on the building. So one of the things, for example, in typical underwriting, a building will have to pay utilities from water, garbage, and electricity. This particular building had separate water meters, and so the only expense that the landlord had was garbage. So that was a big value add because the expenses on this one, as far as utilities were concerned, would be lower than normal. Then we also took into consideration what his new taxes would be. So again, for those who don't know how to do that, you can use the simple rule of just 1.25 of what you're going to buy it for. But the better way to go would be to pull up the actual property tax records of that property. And you could do that by logging into the various municipalities' websites and plugging in the address or the assessor's parcel number of that property, and you're going to get what's called the ad valorem rate, right? And it's going to be some weird number like 1.16 or 1.26. It depends on what city that you go into. What you also want to look at from there is whatever the bonds are, because although the property tax bill will increase based on what the new guy bought it for, which is usually means that the property taxes will go up because very rarely do you end up buying property less than what the prior person bought it for. Your bonds and assessments, they remain the same. Okay, so when you look at your property tax bill picture, you have to look at that entire bill. And what you'll find is that sometimes it's a lot higher than the 1.25% rule of thumb in analyzing property taxes.
Now, how much were the rents total on all 3 units?
At the time, the rents were $4,450, right? And we ascertained that the market rents for those units were closer to $1,800 per unit.
Okay, so just to break it down, the total rents averages out to about $1,483 per unit. So
Yes.
that's the average rent per unit. Now, at the time, the market rate for these units were about $1,800.
Right.
Now, that was a year ago, January 2018. January 2019, we've seen markets go up a little bit,
In
and
fact,
now
you
it's
just said it was
1,900.
1900, yeah. So I was surprised after just prior to the show, we had a little quick chat as to where are the markets now in 2019, and a 2-bedroom, 1-bath will usually command about $1,900. So even though this particular owner, when he bought the property, wasn't at market rent, and our target was to get us up to 1,800, right? In fact, the difference between what you're actually getting and what the market will bear, that's what you call the loss to lease. So you want to know what that is so that you can have that benchmark or goal to be able to get to. And when you're defining how you get to there, you have to look at the parameters of, well, I can't just raise my rents like 28%. Otherwise, well, back in the day you could, but now you can't.
Well, talking about raising rents, that's one big misconception that we see here a lot in the Bay Area is that in the Bay Area, you have a lot of cities that have rent control. San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, now Richmond has it. And many people think if the property is located outside of these rent control jurisdictions, that they can come in and just raise rents straight to market. Now, in the past, you could, because as long as you gave at least a 60-day notice for any increase above 10%, you could take people up to market. However, there's a lot of new laws coming in every single year. And recently, with a lot of the California wildfires, there was a state of emergency placed about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, by Governor Brown. Now, what this state of emergency does is it kicks into effect price gouging laws, which also affects rental prices. So once a state of emergency is filed, price gouging laws kick in, and the most you can legally raise rent on anyone is 10% within any 12-month period. So now, even if your property is in San Pablo, there's no rent control, the most you can increase rents is only 10%. Until the state of emergency expires, then you can go back to doing business as normal. Now, is it still recommended to do anything more than 10%? Well, probably not, because 10% is still a pretty decent return. Sometimes you want to avoid doing an increase where you're going to end up with a vacancy and now have to completely remodel a unit or get it up to par for a market rent.
In fact, the easy answer to that would just be ask your property manager or your local real estate professional if it would be a good idea or not. In fact, kind of going off of what you mentioned, so the client who bought it for $700,000 a year ago, where the rent started out at $4,450. During that 1 year of management with us, we've actually raised the rent a grand total of currently of 11.671% above its start rate. So it simply went from $4,450 a month to $5,038 a month, right? So a relatively small increase. But that small increase created equity of $118,138. In fact, I'll kind of break that down. How do we get to that number? But that's the power of just that small little rental increase. Again, that the tenants could perfectly afford, and we're still actually below what the market will bear. Because now that, when we started out a year ago, the market would bear $1,800 per unit. Whereas now, coming into January 2019, it's closer to $1,900 per unit. Keep in mind, whenever the real estate market slows down, as far as buying on single-family homes are concerned, those people aren't suddenly leaving, they're renting. And so what that's doing is it's creating a demand for rents, and those rents are stabilizing. And if you have more units, you create more stability, you create more economies of scale, and you create a better return. Now, do you want to add anything to that, Mark?
No, that was good.
Okay. So just looking at this particular property, the client bought it for $700,000. It was grossing at the time $4,450. We took into consideration the actual utilities. One of the big perks I brought out was, hey, you only got to pay garbage. You don't have to pay your other utilities. The tenants actually are accustomed to paying that. The ones who are currently there at the property and have been there for 5+ years each.
And we're not talking about RUBS, the ratio utility billing. We are talking about the water is separately metered, which allows the tenants to pay their own water bill.
Yeah, in fact, just some buildings you'll find. Again, this is part of the different things you should be looking for. If you find a building, an apartment building, or multiple units with separate water meters, that's a huge plus, because then you're not just giving them a RUBS. And what Mark is referring to is many buildings, especially new developments, are master metered, but because of the increase of rent in the Bay Area, but also various rental increase restrictions, a lot of landowners will resort to RUBS, where they prorate or run a very, very close estimate of what every individual's tenant share is of the utilities, and then they have to pay an additional fee on top of their rent for their share of the utilities. This building had separate meters altogether, so there was no estimate. It was, here's the bill. You don't even have to run an estimate. This is what you used, and this is what the local utility billed you. Now, as part of the underwriting on the property, like as I mentioned, we took into consideration repairs, capital improvements, which is different. Capital improvements are one-time things that you're going to have to do every several years, like a roof or a big major ticket item. Whereas repair,
new furnace,
you're right, is somebody broke a window or somebody flushed something down the toilet they shouldn't have, and now you got to pay somebody to clean it up. And these are both different underwriting expenses that you have to take into consideration, which is a big mistake a lot of investors make. That I see is that they'll look at the property with too much of a honeymoon period in mind, and it never works out that way.
Now, one thing as far as handling repairs, because the one thing I see a lot of owners really want to do is minimize the cost of those repairs, because minimizing expenses gives you a better NOI. At the end of the day, your building is going to be performing better. Now, one of the things you want to look at when you purchase a new building is take a look at the leases, get the leases to someone who's a legal real estate attorney who can take a look at those leases and really analyze them in detail, because the one thing you want to do, if you can legally do so, is give the tenant a 30-day notice or modify the lease in a way to where they become responsible for any damages that they cause at the property. You also want to make sure that they have renter's insurance, because many times renter insurance will cover up to a certain dollar amount repairs that are caused because the tenants damaged it either on purpose or by accident. So many times, if, like, for example, a kid or someone flushes something down the drain that they shouldn't have flushed, and now it causes, let's say, a $300 repair, you may be able to then bill that right back to the tenant as part of their charges, and then that saves you the actual cost. You'll have to pay it up front, but then you get reimbursed by the tenant. But you have to make sure that your lease agreements allow for that, and also double check with local and state requirements.
So, long story short, after taking into consideration the income and expenses, we figured out that the property's current net operating income at the time was $40,000 a year, or $3,383 a month before making a mortgage payment. So now, when you take that number of $40,599.60 and you compare it to a $700,000 cash purchase, what you get is a 5.8% return on your money. So if the market will bear a 5% return, then that property could have sold as much as $738,000 to as much as $811,000, right? In fact, you'll see that in those bidding wars that occur on single-family residences, and to some degree, you'd even see it on apartment buildings, right? Because different buyers for apartment buildings have different perspectives. Also, sometimes an owner who's selling a different another property, known as a down leg in a 1031 exchange, they've got very, very specific deadlines that they have to meet, or they got to pay the capital gains on that property. So they're willing to buy an apartment building, as I mentioned earlier, at a slightly lower return, perceiving that the market risk is lower. So they'll buy at a 5 cap or a 4.9 cap, knowing that they're going to slowly hold that property and it'll get to a 7, 8, 9, 10. And right along the way, the value is going up. Now, in this case, the client came in with some immediate equity, roughly $38,000 of equity, because the property could be valued closer to $738,000. Now, the owner selling the property, he was also coming out of a 1031 exchange, and so he needed to roll his value or the equity that he had created. And again, he's nothing wrong with him. He made a lot of money from the sale of this property also. So he needed to make sure he had an individual who would be able to perform. Now, the significant part of what you want to take away from here is that this initial purchase or acquisition of a 3-unit building started out at a 5.8% return on their money, as opposed to if they were going to buy the same $700,000 property and rent it out as a house, that return on investment would be closer to 2 or maybe 1.5% cap rate. And then the other part of this is that as we go through the property and realistically map out where the rents should be, will the property go up in value because the cap rate goes up? So let's look at real time. It started out at $4,450 a month, and now currently, as of January 2019, it grosses $5,038 a month. That net operating income has increased just a little bit, and in so doing, the property has gone to a value closer to $743,000 to as much as $800,000. Again, depending upon, when I say as much as, it depends on who might be willing to buy it at his higher net operating income, depending on what the 1031 exchange that they might be coming out of. But this individual who owns this property not only is seeing that type of return, but on a cash flow basis, he was actually netting about $1,027 a month to start. This is back in January of 2018, because it's now 2019. Time flies. Now, what does $1,027 a month mean? Well, that's the net cash. That's the actual cash flow that he would have after he paid his mortgage, because he didn't buy the property cash. He actually put a down payment, paid some closing costs, and he financed the difference. Right? Remember, a cap rate takes into consideration if you didn't have a mortgage, if you bought it cash. Well, $1,027 a month, annualize this to $12,331 a year, and the individual buying this property, down payment, closing cost, total came out of pocket $268,845. So now you compare that net cash flow of $12,331 a year against an investment of $268,000, and on that cash, he's making 4.59% return. Again, just a little under 5, but still pretty good. But you also have to take into consideration that when he makes that mortgage payment, and his mortgage payment was roughly $2,355.64, that was the principal and interest, the interest portion was only $1,795. So you have a principal reduction. And when you annualize that number, the actual taxable cash flow that he makes is not $12,000, it's closer to $19,000. So when you take $19,048.56 and you compare that against his actual out-of-pocket of $268,000, that individual started out making a 7.09% return on investment. So when you look at that in perspective of, if I put my money in the bank, how much am I earning? If I leave my money in a mutual fund, how much am I earning? And again, for those who are in the stock world, whenever you sell a stock, that's when you actually have a realized gain. Other than that, what you have is you're looking at your money and you're saying, oh, look, my stock went up. Oh, look, my stock went down. But when you make that sale and you actually realize that gain, you're going to get taxed.
Or realize loss if you bought Apple stock a year ago.
Exactly. So now why I mentioned that fact is to compare it against the real estate investment. Earlier, I mentioned depreciation. So there's various forms of depreciation that you can apply to your investment. And I'm just going to focus in on the regular old straight line depreciation. The IRS lets you take the cost basis or what you bought it for, in this case, $700,000. They let you allocate 80% of that value because that's the building, and 20% rule of thumb is supposed to be used against the land, which you can't depreciate because you could burn land, flood land, nuke land, and doesn't get old. It still holds its value, especially in California. But the building has wear and tear. So when you take 80% of $700,000 and you divide that over 27 and a half years, and some of you can their accountant might want to actually look at the assessed value and run that exact ratio between the improvement value and the total assessed value, which can range anywhere from 65 to 75%. In this case, I'm just using 80% of 700,000, and I'm dividing that over 27 and a half years. And what that does is, or what it results in, is it creates a loss or a paper loss or tax write-off of $20,363.64, which can be used against that positive income of $19,048.56 that you would normally be taxed on. In this case, you don't have to get taxed on that. Now, before, just a quick disclaimer, one of the things is that you have to also sit down with your accountant and determine how much of that depreciation you can take, because when you're gainfully employed versus being in the business, there's certain limitations, which I'm not going to jump into because that's not what we're looking at. Regardless of those limitations on the amount of depreciation you can take, it's still a better investment than when you buy a house. And it's still a better investment than when you buy stock that you look at and go, look, it's gone up in value. Look, it's gone down in value. Look, I sold it and I made a profit and now I got to pay the tax. Real estate's one of those vehicles of investment that allows you to be able to have cash flow and not pay tax on it, or pay a very little tax on that actual income that you're making, while simultaneously appreciating in value, which kind of segues to the whole reason of cap rates and NOI that I talked about earlier. Just from that simple little increase in monthly income from $4,450 to now $5,038, the value of the property, as I mentioned, went up anywhere from $750 to as much as $800,000, because that's what another investor would be willing to buy it for based on its higher net operating income. So if this owner did decide to sell, he would have roughly $50,000 to as much as a $112,000 capital gain, which again, under normal investment vehicles, you'd have to pay taxes on immediately, but not real estate. Not if you 1031 exchange it and roll it into another investment property.
Now, before we continue, the one thing you've mentioned several times is cap rate. But cap rate only measures 1 year. If you look at multiple years, so let's say you're creating an analysis and you're looking at 2-3 years out, and then you're estimating what you could sell the property for, the equity you pull out on the sale, and then you're looking at your internal rate of return.
Right, your IRR. Right?
Now you're adding up the various years of cash flow. You're looking at how much you invested into the property and how much you've actually netted out of the property. That's a whole nother calculation, which we'll do that on another show, on another episode, getting into how you actually calculate that. But the one thing I also want to add to this is when you're running these numbers, a lot of it can sound amazing, right? You can predict based on hitting certain financial goals like increasing rents, the equity that's created. But you want to also create a separate plan in case things go south, in case a recession hits, in case of other additional expenses that come up that maybe you were not aware of. They talk about $300 per unit per year for capital improvements, but in the Bay Area with some capital improvements like a wall furnace can cost $1,600 now, or a water heater can cost up to $2,000 in some cases. Now, that $300 per unit per year for capital improvements may not be realistic. You might have to modify those numbers. So it's something to where you want to sit down, run these numbers, or if you don't know how to run these numbers, hire a professional to run these numbers for you so that you can get an idea of what you're looking at. And then you create your entry, you create your exit strategy, and then you create a strategy for any modifications, any variables that may come up any of those years. I think that's really important, where a lot of people, I think, fail because they will hire an agent or a commercial broker that understands how to do an analysis, but then that's it. That's all they get presented, and then they go off and buy a building. In fact, I just have a client that BCRE didn't represent him, but they were represented by another commercial broker. They came to us for management, and I'm surprised they didn't even do a roof inspection when they bought the property. And now they're going to have to replace the roof, and they're looking at a $30,000 expense that was not calculated in any of their real estate analysis.
Right.
And that's something that they did. If they did a $200 roof inspection, they would have discovered that, and they could have added that into their financial strategy. But now that's a huge variable that they didn't plan for.
Right. And just kind of going off of what Marc said, not trying to throw any particular real estate agent or office under the bus, but ask your agent if they themselves own property or if they're in the business. And because that should be a pretty good indicator if they know what they're talking about. What you'll find a lot of times, especially in the investment realm, is that that agent will have learned how to run these numbers in college, or maybe were taught how to run these types of numbers at the office to conduct a sale, but then they don't necessarily invest themselves, and so they lack that experience. And again, look at things with a little bit of rose-colored glasses or a honeymoon period, or they might just have to make a sale, right?
Well, the other problem that I see is a lot of first-time investors that are going to buy. Maybe they decide they want to buy a duplex, triplex, or fourplex, right? Great beginner investment properties. The problem is they go to the real estate agent that they know, that they've worked with in the past, that really specializes in selling single-family homes, and so they'll go to them and say, "Hey, I want to buy a fourplex. Find me a fourplex." And typically, single-family home agents are looking at fourplexes. They don't even know, because it's not something I used to sell single-family homes. It's not something that they teach you or that's common in that world. And so many single-family agents will look at a fourplex and say, "Oh, well, here's 10 fourplexes that sold around these prices. This fourplex that you're thinking of buying has to be worth in this area." Well, that's not the case, because if the rents are super low, well, then the value is going to be super low. So again, if you're going to buy any investment property, you really need to use an agent and a broker that's familiar with real estate analysis and that can properly guide you, because otherwise you might be getting into a really bad investment that's going to give you the same return as putting your money in a bank account, or even worse, negative return.
Right. And again, all of these various underwriting guidelines that we're talking about, they're designed to be a benchmark. But then once you actually look at an individual property, you have to look at the various idiosyncrasies of that property and be able to identify its value adds, right? Whether it's I raise the rents 10%, it's going to go up in value this, or if I put in a better type of utility system, my utility bills will drop. Then this will create better cash flow. There's various things that a building that you could do to a building to increase its value and its cash flow, and a lot of that is what's involved in dissecting a value add. Right? It's going to be different for every property, and so you have to have that when you go into any type of property analysis.
Yeah, and that's going to be a whole nother show and segment in itself when you're analyzing capital improvements to get higher rents, because sometimes you can't just simply increase rents without providing value, depending on certain circumstances with the property, the tenants, the condition of the property. So in order to create value from the tenant to be willing to pay a higher rent, you're going to have to do some capital improvements. Then that's a whole nother analysis as to, well, how much are you going to invest and how much of a premium value you're going to get back. And you have to really take a look at that. And that's going to be a whole nother episode that we can do on that type of analysis. So I think we've kind of hit our limit as far as time when it comes to this first episode. I think we went way above and beyond what we were originally planning to. But as you can see, there's a lot of information that when it comes to real estate analysis and just with one property, there's a lot of different things you have to consider. And so as we continue doing this show, we're going to refine this a bit more and try to hit a lot of the main focus points. But I mean, really, there's so much that goes into it that it's hard to focus on everything in just a very short period of time. So if you have any questions, please email us any questions. We're going to go ahead and link up our emails in the description for the podcast and the video. Send us questions that you have. We'll go ahead, put it as a question of the day on our next episode. And if we really get a lot of questions, the one thing that we're toying with is maybe some kind of platform or some kind of membership site or something to where a lot of the viewers can basically ask us questions and we can answer these questions and even feature some of these questions on the show, because I know a lot of people are really interested in this information that we can share.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mark. In fact, as Mark said, feel free to please comment, ask us questions. We love questions, and the harder the questions, the better. Let us know if you liked what you heard and if it was of value to you and what you would like to hear more of. And again, if you're local to the Bay Area, we're here at the office all the time. So
in all California.
Yeah, in fact, we're putting our email out there. Stop by and visit us, and we'll chat and do a little quick consultation.
And the one thing I think would be a lot of fun to do is if you, the viewers and listeners, if you have a property, an investment property that you own that you want us to do an analysis on and maybe take a look at it to see what options you have available, send it to us. Send us an email and we will go ahead do a free analysis for you.
And it'll be better than Zillow's analysis.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just trust me on that one.
Yeah, we'll do an analysis and basically present to you the various options that you can do with that property. And sometimes, we're going to be completely honest with you, sometimes you may have a pretty good investment or you might not be ready to quite sell that property. We might recommend for you to not sell it and hold on to that property for maybe another year or two. So if that's the case, we'll be honest, we'll tell you. And I think...
in fact, I think that's a big value add for us, is the fact that we're not in a position where we have to sell you something. Many times, if my client's getting into a bad deal and we find that out during a due diligence period, we'll tell them to back out and not buy the property. Or if somebody is looking to sell their property, if they can't roll it into something better, and many times we'll advise them to hold on to it. So again, reach out to us. Let us know if you liked what you heard and what else you'd like to hear more of. And with that, we'll catch you next time.
And sign off. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening.